write one of the most influential books in urban planning. You may have heard of it. It's called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Have we read this? Have we heard of it? You should write that down. And high fives for those of you who have. So this is where she challenged his short-sightedness of modern urban planning, and she used her own observations and experiences to conclude that what makes a safe and livable and inclusive and desirable neighborhood. So that's something that we'll touch on briefly. The battle between these two is often referenced in urban planning. Do we have urban planners here? There's no school of urban planning here just yet, right? But some of you might have some experience in your design studios. So this is one that crystallizes and wildly different approaches taken by two people who became legendary in this field. And then there's Whitney Young. Around that same time, he's a civil rights leader. He was invited to keynote the conference for the American Institute of Architects, where he advocated for the marginalized in the United States. So we're celebrating, well, just this past October, we celebrated 55 years of that speech, which he gave in Portland, Oregon. And NOMA had our conference in Portland, Oregon this past October. Just a shameless plug, we are gonna be in Baltimore, so make sure that Utah Valley sends all of you to Baltimore to the Waterfront Marriott. So every year our conference is in a different city in October, and it gets bigger and bigger each year. And the students are pretty much taking over the conference. It's basically the student conference. You know, I made a little joke about that when we were in Portland. But the part of his speech that resonates with me the most is as follows. The crisis is not in our cities, ladies and gentlemen. The crisis is in our hearts, the kinds of human beings we are. He goes on to say the audience of architects that they are risking generations not yet adults, and generations yet unborn. So I do a lot of speaking on how Detroit has been affected by the built environment, how I've been affected by the built environment, and the Robert Moses era, and my being affected as I'm a product of this type of urban planning, this urban planning model, which was fought against by Jane Jacobs, who's become one of my heroes. And as a person born in those upcoming generations that he mentioned, that he spoke of in his speech, except I happen to be, or go on and study architecture and then become a designer on the other side of that table, someone who is responsible for the built environment despite my circumstances. So what does an inclusive future mean for a family on Detroit's west side living in that type of development? As I stand there with the bottle in my mouth and socks on while I'm wearing sandals. Yeah, I didn't know my story would turn out to be something inspirational or used as an example of belonging, inclusion, and resilience. And I didn't know the efforts of Whitney Young and Jane Jacobs that they would have, or even Robert Moses, how it would affect me and my future identity directly. This is a slide of the housing development where I grew up. It is Detroit's version of urban renewal and post-war modernism. It's a development where I grew up, and it was demolished, surrounded by 3 major streets and a freeway running along north-south, which is going to be to your left of the screen. And it was basically an incubator of crime and vandalism, and is seen as the creator of dependency of its residents that they have on public assistance. It was gated and enclosed with limited resources. In your lower right-hand corner, that is my elementary school, which still stands vacant today, and to me it kind of represents a forgotten symbol of what embodies all those things. It's where I experienced my first point of exclusion. And so there was a black wrought iron fence around this development. I usually tell people that it is not just a physical gate, but a mental one. It's locking people in who have to live in a place like this mentally. A lot of my family lived here, childhood friends. We We went to Herman School and we grew up through high school together in every class, and so did our parents. And a lot of people were stuck in that gate. They were stuck in that fence. We only moved out because it was demolished. And when it was demolished, a lot of people just scattered themselves around the perimeter, waiting for something to be built so that they could move back. And it was developed or demolished just before I graduated high school, and it sat vacant for 10 years, looking just like this, with the school still standing there. During that time, I had gone off to college to study architecture, and I strong-armed my way into a firm called Hamilton Anderson, where I started out answering the phones, because in these firms, you just have to get in fastest way you can and prove yourself and work your way up. Create some allies and some alliances who will fight for you when it's time to do red lines and pick up some architectural experience. But I was able to go back there and oversee construction of this new development, and that's one of the proudest moments of my life, just happening to be at a firm that the Detroit Housing Commission selected to oversee construction and redevelopment of this. So by then, I had my CA experience, I had my drawing experience, I had 1 degree, and you know, it was just a pleasure to, it was surreal to even be there. So a lot of the full circle moments in my life, I do owe to architecture, whether it be the most random thing or something that I had a feeling would come. So this was one of those random things. I didn't know that my future would include me, a girl who grew up in places and spaces that did not nurture my love for art or drawing or sketching, that I would end up studying architecture in Paris and standing in front of art like Monet's water lilies. I had only imagined seeing his artwork 3 or 5 inches tall in the books that we study in schools of architecture. I never thought I'd be standing in front of them in Paris, in Musée de Lingerie, where they are up to 8 feet tall and 20 and 30 feet wide. Who's been to Paris? I strongly encourage anyone who can study abroad to go. I didn't study abroad until I was in my master's program, but my university was going to Paris. We went to Paris, had a 4-day weekend. We went to Barcelona for that. Got to see all the Antonio Gaudi we could soak in, and it was just an amazing experience, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't realize that I loved and that I had in my future. So that was not something that was accessible to kids where I lived. And as you could probably tell, I attended a college at a predominantly white institution, where I was the only person of color in my graduating class, and I didn't have instructors that looked like me either, or learned about architects that looked like me. So I didn't even learn about Jane Jacobs or Whitney Young. And then there were many times where I questioned my belonging, and even it stretched into the office where I worked during my career. But while I was in Paris and got to experience Ville Savoy, whenever someone, they would ask me where I'm from, and I would say Detroit, they'd be like, oh, you know what? They weren't familiar with that. But if I said Detroit, they're like, oh, 8 Mile. They're familiar with that. They're familiar with Eminem. So. But Detroit is originally a French word, pronounced Detroit. So I guess that's what I should have said in the first place. So this is Garden View Estates today. This is what it looks like today. The development where I grew up, and you remember that little girl standing in front of those 2-story buildings. The development, this is where I grew up. It's where I had the pleasure to lead construction after living there under much different conditions. It's the place where back then, my grandmother raised her 7 children, and one of them was my mother. So my grandmother, who you see in this slide, like many other residents, she didn't move very far away in hopes of returning once they were rebuilt, and we didn't know if they were gonna be rebuilt or not. After 10 years had gone by, but just, folks they stayed because they had nowhere else to go. And mentally they had nowhere else to go. So in my opinion, that wrought iron fence that surrounded the development, it was definitely not physical, as I mentioned, but it was a mental barrier, a subliminal message meant to cage the minds of the people who had to be there. And she was one of those former residents who did move back, and she's very proud to know that I had a hand in creating a much more positive place considering the upbringing that we experienced. As I went on to oversee similar projects in the city, I began to notice there was no one who looked like me on these project teams. And the users of these spaces had no say in what was going there, what was going to be rebuilt. So as a former user of these poorly designed spaces who switched the side of the table as a designer, my passion became creating access to architecture and design based on the challenges that I've faced getting here. So I was asking myself, where are the people that look like me and why aren't they involved in these spaces? And that's what really pushed me to create 400 Forward. So the diversity issues, I wanted to go back to this. This is a place where a lot of Motown greats grew up and lived, like Diana Ross and Temptations, and these are the types of spaces that still created musical geniuses and artistic geniuses and geniuses such as myself. But you know, it was just a huge inspiration for me to just be able to walk through this and realize what my passion was. You know, sometimes it takes people a lifetime to realize that, and some folks, they realize that early on, even while they're in college. But I had not figured that out until this project. And so even with 400 Forward, the diversity issues that Whitney Young spoke about 50 years ago, they are still very prevalent today. Black women only represent, as I mentioned, less than half of 1%. Imagine that. Imagine what those decimals look like. Of the United States, and that's not a reflection of Detroit or the rest of our communities in this world. So to bring awareness to this statistic, I founded 400 Forward, and it was at a time where there were only 115,000 licensed architects in the U.S. But through this program, and with partnerships like the one I have with Graphisoft, and the Detroit Housing Commission, and even Ford Motor Company, we can seek out and support the next group of women with an underlying focus on African American girls. It's become my mission to be the face that I was looking for growing up. And so my mentees, or our mentees, have had the opportunity to learn about architecture and urban design and the processes and programs that we use to work. And I can also provide financial support toward college and along their path to licensure. So it's just rewarding for me to even be in a position to do that. There's not really an application process. As long as there's money, it will be funded. Licensing exams, supplies for architecture school, whatever it is that they need, because I just remember that being a struggle of mine coming into the College of Architecture, and I was not prepared. Even though I was coming out of Detroit Public Schools as a 4.0 student, I was not prepared to go and study something like architecture out of my environment. And really, just one more thing to add to that. One thing that I tell my mentees, and it's a phrase I heard Yara Shahidi, who's a very young activist and actress, on her TED Talk. I haven't even had a TED Talk yet, and she has. But she made a statement that you are the anomaly if you succeed and the expectation if you fail. And it just was, just something that stuck with me, because I know that was something, when you use words like disadvantaged youth, like when you're going into these schools to mentor kids or teach them something, these words have power. These words are in their minds. A word like disadvantaged youth said to me, there's only so far that you think I can go. There's only so much that you think that I know, because I'm disadvantaged because of my surroundings or my class or because of what I look like, and I won't be the expectation, So I'm still the anomaly today, and it's a quote that I use all the time, because it encourages me to the point where I know others who hear it will also feel encouraged. So this is a slide that of Kat Holmes. She wrote a book called Mismatch: How Inclusion Shapes Design. That was listed as a text with the summary that I sent. So again, it's called Mismatch: How Inclusion Shapes Design. It is about the user experience. She's worked at Google, she's worked at Salesforce, she's worked with me and someone who is paraplegic. and other people who have experienced extreme points of inclusion to write about the steps that you could take to design a better world, whether it's, remote controls that you use for gaming and maybe you don't have hands, or whether it is, she used an example of a car created for women and how stereotypical it was, maybe not back in the day when they did that, but thinking back to it now, I think you could learn a lot. Excuse me. I think I made good time without having to cough or take a sip. So just a little more on this slide. As I was presenting this in one city, she was presenting she was speaking on her book in another city, and I texted her, and it just so happened that I was up on screen when she was, presenting on stage, and we were both presenting about each other. But as I get closer to the points and that I wanted to make and the takeaways that I want you to leave with, I just wanted to talk about ways that you can become an advocate for change and belonging and inclusion, and how you can impact the next generation of designers. And these points are detailed in the book, where I contributed to with Kat Holmes. And it's called, again, How Inclusion Shapes Design. She's a global expert in inclusive design, pictured here. The chapter that I wrote was called With and For. And it comes from a Latin phrase, which I won't butcher in Latin, but in English it means nothing about us without us. So you are designing with us. You're not swooping into Detroit with capes on your backs to save us because we don't know what we need or what we want. We've had a lot of very large firms come into our city to redesign our waterfront, to work on skyscrapers downtown, designing at us, like no community engagement, no bringing voices to the table of the people who made that city, who brought the culture to that city and made it what it was. So she really came to Detroit and she did a lot of research. We went to the nice neighborhoods, the brand new sparkly parts of downtown. We went to my old neighborhood and sat on a bench and ate lunch. She wanted to really experience and do the research that it took to even talk about a city like Detroit. And a lot of people don't do that. They observe from afar. They're presenting research and statistics, and they haven't stepped foot in that place or spoken to the people who live there. So I really respect her. I actually met her at South by Southwest in Austin, where she was really getting into inclusive design, and it was becoming a thing some years ago, around 2016. And she wanted to leave Google and work on something like this. And so together we just kind of stepped out on faith and went to follow our passions, and we have a great friendship. So the first lesson you'll learn in my chapter is to seek out points of exclusion. As I'm standing in front of my old elementary school, James Herman School, for me, belonging began with feeling excluded. I didn't know what it felt like to belong. Even when I was in college, I didn't know what it felt like to belong because I was the only person there who looked like me, and and that makes a difference. Sometimes it seems like that's irrelevant to some folks, but it's highly relevant to the people who experience exclusion and the people who don't, especially as designers of the built environment. It's something that we each need to understand about each other. And being referred to as disadvantaged youth, again, like I mentioned earlier, there's no limit to what I could accomplish, but at times in these points of exclusion, when you're just out on an island alone, and you know that you have the potential and you just need someone to nurture that, that person could be anybody. It could be a fellow classmate, it could be someone in faculty who's not even in the College of Architecture. But just not being exposed to architecture, I think, really affected me once I got to the College of Architecture. I did not have access to the resources that my peers had when they were starting college. So the points of exclusion for me were barriers to things like access to financial support and mentorship and things like that. So that's the first thing that you can do as someone who wants to practice inclusive design and creating spaces of belonging. find out what those points of exclusion are. Identify situational challenges. You might encounter a situation where, as a professor, you have a student, or as a student, you have a peer who is a first generation college graduate like I am. My parents are not first generation, or they did not go to college. I had to figure things out on my own. So, you know, it's a badge of honor for those of us who, and no matter what you look like, are first generation college graduates. But I had not been on a college campus. These students that are my mentees here, this is us at Lawrence Tech in the College of Architecture with the design studios behind us, had not been on a college campus. So imagine starting at a college, walking into a class, and you had never been on a college campus before. There are people who experience that. And it's, you know, just, it's a challenge. It's what we call a situational challenge. If you're in a position of leadership or in a firm or university, I always encourage people to take the time to mentor someone who does not look like you. I ended up here where I am because of two white males. They're the ones in positions of power most of the time. And so before I got to Smith Group, I was at a black-owned firm. Hamilton Anderson is a black-owned firm. But I am where I am today because of those gentlemen who I kind of forced myself on them because I just grew into having an outgoing personality. Believe it or not, I was very shy, very quiet growing up. I was invisible to the world growing up. As the oldest of four girls, I was still the one that nobody knew about, the one that nobody saw. And I think what helped me break out of my shell was being in these types of situational challenges where I was forced to prove myself. I was proving myself to myself. You know, I had a lot of people who doubted me, and sometimes instructors that said, maybe this isn't the career for you, or maybe you should explore another major. And that's not what I wanted to do, so I just had to keep telling myself that this is something that I've got to prove to myself, not only them, but most importantly to myself. So I realized that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and if I need the help, there might be an instructor that is not used to my learning style, or someone at a firm that has not worked with someone of color before. So it's all about just breaking down those challenges and finding your voice and using that voice to get to where you want to be. Which brings me to recognizing personal biases. The woman on the far left is Laura Walker. She's a great friend of mine, an amazing architect. She was a colleague of mine at Smith Group. She's since started her own design firm. But she's here discussing with a few of my mentees the importance of involving the unheard voices at the table. She understands that she is only there to listen, because without involving those voices of the user community, the built environment of our cities could likely reflect her own abilities and needs and assumptions. So sometimes it takes some time to realize what those biases are. I think there are a lot of resources today that firms are bringing in, universities are bringing in to address those types of things. But once you cross that path, like, I think there's just a world of possibilities just to create spaces where people can thrive and live. Because I didn't have a picture of, I actually grew up, you know, in the 1900s, as the kids today say, where we did not have smartphones and cameras everywhere all day. So I do have pictures of like the type of space where I grew up in Herman Gardens, and you can see that in a documentary that I'm going to mention later. But it was not a space that encouraged me to learn. It was from the concrete walls to the floors peeling, to the paint falling, to the books falling apart, to the removal of the art programs when I was in elementary school. Where am I supposed to get that? I need the designer to provide that for me. I need the designer to understand what I need. I need the designer to remove their personal views of a kid in a space like that and create a space like that. And you can learn more about this in an amazing documentary that I was a part of that I'll mention Actually, I'll mention it right now. It's called Design for All. I knew that was gonna happen. I was gonna forget. It was produced by Target. It was on Hulu for a while. It's on YouTube now. But if you go to 400forward.com and click through some of the media links, you'll see it at the top. Design for All. There are designers from Mass Media Group who designed a school for autistic children. There are about 5 subjects, and I'm one of them. One of the women who they featured does not have arms. Her arms, just for no reason, stopped working. And so she had to navigate her way through the world, not being able to use a doorknob, not being able to brush her teeth, using her feet for these things. And all of her stories loop in at the end of the documentary. It's only about 45 minutes long. I meant to list that as a kind of text, but Design for All, it's on 400 Forward's website. I think it'll just open your eyes to things that you haven't thought about before. Maybe you thought you knew, or maybe you thought you experienced, or maybe you have a family member who experienced these types of challenges, but really they have become the designers of work because they are the people who experience the most extreme points of exclusion. So why not learn from them? Providing equivalent experiences. So here it's pretty straightforward. If you're in a position to provide opportunities to lead to someone who is very capable, but likely overlooked for promotions or for fair pay, or for the lead part in presenting your project, on the design team. Most of my advocates, as I mentioned, they did not look like me. So a little excerpt from the book, Mismatch. Avoid creating mismatched interactions and obstacles to leadership positions that influence design decisions that affect these communities. So if I had not been given the opportunity to lead by these gentlemen who did not, I didn't have any experience in project management, but we were going after a project in the city of Detroit where they said, we're gonna require your project team to have some diversity, and you need to have some people of color in leadership, and you need to provide support for them to succeed and not set them up for failure. And then they knew what my goals were, and they presented this to me as an opportunity to gain this experience. And I knew them, and I, personally, I knew that I was not being put in this role because of what I look like or because I wore a skirt. Even though, maybe there were some people at my firm that thought that. And out of their own unresolved biases, said something to me like, for example, we were at a diversity, equity, inclusion training session. And this was an architect that I looked up to. He was, one of the smartest folks there, just asking me what I was working on. And I told him about the project. And I told him about, how this is something that is new to me. And I'm gonna have, the 2 principals supporting me in this role because it's required by our client. And the first thing that he said was, what happens when you fail? And this is something that he immediately looked like a deer in headlights when he said this, because he suddenly realized what he said was BS, but you're expecting me to fail because you don't think I'm capable of doing this job. You think I was put in this job for DEI reasons and not because of the fact that I'm qualified for it. There are no other project managers that have 2 master's degrees in this firm, so what other reason, without the obvious reasons, would I not be able to gain this experience? So these are the types of things that and we had a very long conversation after that, and he was very apologetic afterward, but I still know that this was, what he said was his immediate, his thought of how he really felt. So, this is something that I just found really meaningful, and I like to use it as an example. We have since worked through they weren't issues, but it was just him needing to get to know me as a person and what I'm qualified to do, and not make assumptions and statements like that at a DEI training, of all places. But there's an example. I'm coming to the end here. Extend the solution to everyone. this is something that I also think is very straightforward. Unfortunately, it's not, because we still have to talk about these things. But one of my favorite quotes from Jane Jacobs reads, "If you give people an environment that they can shape themselves, they would not only be happier, you would have a completely different city and a completely different talent base." I think this statement is profound because it represents the things that Jane Jacobs and Whitney Young were fighting for, and it still rings very true today. If we could all be much better designers and better just creators if we were able to have the opportunities to shape these spaces ourselves and just understand what these words mean: belonging and inclusivity. I wanted to end with this drone but this is a shot that you'll see in the documentary. What is behind me? It is my elementary school. It was taken during the filming of my feature in Kat's book. My school standing behind me, vacant and still very structurally strong. It represents the past, and the drone flying above me that was filming me represents the future of cities in my eyes. And I know that it's going to take a lot of effort for us to drive a sustainable, real change together so that we don't end up 50 years from now or 55 years from now, like we are today from Whitney Young's speech, with the same statistics that he talked about 50 years ago. The needle has not moved. So it should be a priority to get this right. And as professionals and as students, we should all be committed to building a diverse and inclusive profession that enables people of all abilities and all walks of life to build a rewarding career and achieve their full potential, and create cities around the world that are as resilient as the people who occupy them. Thank you for your time and for your attention and for staying back and waiting for me to get through this presentation. I wanted to open up the floor for any questions or comments, if you have any. I know it's 7 o'clock, but I appreciate being able to come and present my work to you.
Thank you.